ladies and gentlemen, Wuthering Waves version 2.5 has dropped, and of course, with the dropping of a new update, we're gonna have the dropping of a tier list update, because there's a new character that's come to Solaris 3, and here there's quite a bit of drama, quite a bit of a situation surrounding her release, and particularly her weapon. So why don't we go ahead, start breaking it all down, and see what this update is all about, starting with the changelog. We're going to go through changelogs for each game mode, ToA, and then WhiWa, and then go over the respective tier lists, and then give a bit of a breakdown over there for the agenda. All right, changelog 2. Okay, I started that off wrong. July 24th, 2025. Sorry, it was the European timing that kind of fucked me over. We'll make this introduction brief and get into the ToA tier list changes right away. But first, we wanted to provide a small update on the progress with the tier list toggles to enable or disable signature weapons and S0 characters. Yeah, this is something that I feel like they should be adding very, very, very soon. Having that toggle to see, okay, is the character using the standard 5-star weapon or a 4-star, or are they using their signature? Because I think that's a bit of like a gap in the tier list right now that a lot of people don't fundamentally understand just looking at the S0, R0, because the gap between certain characters and their performance can actually be somewhat high. And the end result of that, right, is due to the design of the kits necessarily, as opposed to, I would say, the weapons. They all seem to be pretty roughly in strength with each other, but then, you know, there are just some very character-specific stat requirements that aren't really factored in. That's still in the works. The team got busy with ZZZ. How dare they work on that game? Just dedicate all your resources to WhiWa. Come on, guys. Not for long, though. Expected to release in a few weeks at maximum and before 2.6. That's good news. Phrolova is highly impacted by her signature weapon, so we'll get ahead of that and discuss her performance with and without her signature in this changelog. Now for the ToA changes. Let's get into them. Phrolova, added as a tier 1 DPS. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. This placement may be a shocker to a lot of you. She might be the lowest ranked DPS on release in the history of the game. This is because Phrolova has a really, really big issue, and that's her signature weapon. Her weapon is simply made to work with her so well that it's practically a requirement to have her perform compared to the DPS in tier 0.5 and particularly tier 0. This is the kind of situation Brant was facing. We recommend checking our calculations on this. Phrolova is very similar to him in this regard. Her damage is balanced around the fact that she actually owns the signature weapon and comes more as a package deal with her weapon rather than a fully fledged out DPS at R0. Yeah, I think the design of this, the design of her weapon, is heavily based off of the fact that, unfortunately, Kuro Games released a weapon called Stringmaster. And if you're all not familiar with how Stringmaster works or what this weapon is, this is, without a doubt, one of the biggest mistakes that I think Kuro made just in terms of their monetization. Making this weapon so general, making it so easy to stack up its effect, and making it so easy to just pull one copy of a limited weapon and gear so many different rectifier users on the roster. And unfortunately, I do believe that Kuro Games kind of like saw this as, okay, if we release another rectifier character, how do we get into a situation where everyone doesn't skip the fucking weapon? Because we made Stringmaster so incredibly, insanely busted. And I think what that's led to is specific kits that are designed around specific damage types that only the weapon, right, is really going to be able to meaningfully support well. And unless there's like a 4-star option that also boosts things like, well, let's just be honest here with her, like echo skill damage, yeah, it's not really something that's going to make a lot of sense. Another big thing about Phrolova is the fact that this massive base attack on the weapon of 587 interacts really, really, really well with her liberation that gives a 120% damage or 120% attack increase, based off of the fact that your base attack from your weapon is what gets calculated into this increase. So there's like a lot of different levers, I think, intentionally built into her kit to not make certain weapons perform exceedingly well on her. And I think that it is, to a degree, a bit of an issue, but we'll have a separate video diving into that later. This one will be focused on the tier list for now. Now let's keep moving. To a point, we'd recommend Camellia over her if you can't afford to spend 1.5x the usual pulls to not only get Phrolova, but her signature as well. If you do have Stringmaster, I think it's a fine alternative, but not everybody has that. However, provided you do have her signature, it's very safe to bump her up to tier 0.5. She's definitely stronger than Camellia in her best team, and with her signature, she's easily the best Havoc DPS, but she's not at the damage level of a Carlotta, Zodi, and Cartithia, even factoring that in. So yeah, it's looking, at least like calculation DPS wise, that Phrolova is definitely not, I would say, like a must pull for the sake of being top of the meta. I personally don't have her at level 90 yet because of the story lockoff on a lot of her mats, but I'm noticing that her team's overall damage, you do have certain members that aren't really there doing a shit ton compared to some other teammates, and then the team as a whole isn't like the most powerful. I would say that Phrolova might actually have an upgrade in the future just based off of how dependent her kit is on echo skills of other teammates, and she might have somebody that like comes in dealing havoc, heavy attack damage, that kind of rounds it out a bit more. Who knows, maybe that'll be Geshu Lin. We'll see for that third slot in the future. But yeah, that's gonna be her ranking, tier 1. A little bit controversial, but I think once you get into the explanation, you start figuring out why her kit is designed in a certain way, it makes quite a bit of sense. All right, now let's move on into Cancerella, tier 1.5 to tier 1. Oh, quite the increase she's made over this time. Pretty easy to understand why Cancerella was bumped up. She's good for Phrolova. Phrolova is pretty good, and more importantly for the R0 tier list, Cancerella is a good alternative for Gen C teams when she has healing and CC. Even with signature weapons, she'd stay in tier 1, but she's comfortably there. Interesting, I thought she would at least bump up a little bit because I heard her personal damage is supposed to be pretty significant with S1, but maybe all the other characters are getting uplifted as well. While we're at it, for those of you who are curious about Rosia, Phrolova isn't strong enough at R0, and Rosia doesn't make big enough of a difference to bump her up a tier, even at R1. So both her and Cancerella will be staying in tier 1, even on that R1 tier list. So what this is basically saying is that Cancerella and Rosia are best in slot teammates for Phrolova, but they as units aren't even that good. And so the end result is that even with Phrolova's release and their team being completed, they're not even being bumped up that much. That's kind of what I meant by I feel like her kit and her damage output, all of that, it has room to change in the future because her current teammates, the best ones she can use, don't even feel that good, which is kind of fucked up, but it is what it is. All right, so that's going to be the ToA changes for now. We'll get into the WhiWa ones in a second. Let's go ahead and get on into what the tier list is looking like at this moment in time. Alrighty. Here we go. Starting off with the DPS category, tier 0 is once again going to remain exactly the same. We're going to have our Carlotta, our Cartithia, and our Zanis over at the top. I think that these characters are sort of like the pinnacle of damage. With Carlotta, I do believe being like second or third best, technically worst out of the lineup over here, but she has probably the most 100% guaranteed damage output. Zani requires a teammate to reach like these incredibly high damage levels, and her attacks are kind of, well, we've all fought Crownless with her. And then Cartithia is sort of just, she's sort of just there, right? She's got a lot of potential, especially with an arrow erosion applier, but, you know, kind of waiting for a 4-star or, you know, a kit like Altos to get buffed for that one. Tier 0.5, we got Camellia, Jancy, and Phoebe. I thought, actually, for a second that Camellia got bumped down to tier 1, but it looks like she's still here. And I think that her performance, especially on Emerald and Genesis, is still, like, something to behold in the current day-to-day. So that's looking pretty solid over here. She does have good AoE, good burst, all of that. Good stuff. Jincy definitely is still at the top of the pack. I think a lot of people have started using her a lot more frequently just because of how reliable she is. And I think that her having some of her expert tech to be bumped up a level, that does make sense as well, because she does have some crazy quick swap rotations, some crazy animation cancels, but nobody actually needs to use them to clear the content. So you have that room to get sweatier if you want, but yeah. Phoebe, I don't know. Phoebe is like, I think tier 0.5 is a good spot for her. I think she was a little bit too crazy in tier 0 because I never found this unit to be like one of the most crazy damaging ones ever. I just found her to be one of like the safer and more casual friendly units because you like fight from range. You can be like 300 feet away and you also like CC the mobs and can teleport. So like she almost feels like the most agile and also like the most safe DPS, and I feel like that's part of it, but I feel like Carlotta is safer than her, while also I think dealing similar, if not a little bit more damage. Now in tier 1 DPSs, we're having Brant over here, Encore, Jian, Havoc Rover, Zhang Liao, and of course, Phrolova. So this is definitely the most like controversial category of them all. And the main thing to keep note of over here is that this is performance based off of S0R0, right? The characters don't necessarily have their signature weapons equipped, and what they're working with are weapons that don't necessarily, right, provide them the best bonuses ever. Mostly like base attack, that sort of stuff. And the thing with Phrolova is that her signature weapon has some very, very, very specific things that directly interact with how her kit does damage. We already talked about the base attack and then her Liberation's 120% attack buff. We already talked about Echo Skill Amplification and how this is the only weapon in the game that has it, and a huge portion of her damage is actually Echo Skills. The end result is sort of just like, it's not that Phrylova's kit is like overloaded and then the weapon makes it like more overloaded. It's that her kit has like all these unique elements that you literally can't satisfy with other rectifier weapons. This is the only 587 base attack rectifier. There's no other rectifier with attack even close to that. So it almost feels like with more weapons coming out in the future, there might be better picks for her, but this seems like the first of its kind, right? Much like how Brandt's weapon was the first of its kind when it came to having a high ER sword. The end result is like, it's just like, it doesn't feel like these weapons are like specifically designed to be overpowered. It's that these weapons fill in a niche that no other weapon can have, and so the gap between them and other options is like so wide. And I think just like looking at this in particular, right, you look at the calculations, it looks like this weapon is 40% better than the standard option. It's because the standard option is so horrifyingly bad on the specific design of Phrylova's kit that it makes the standard option just look like complete dog shit in comparison. If you guys want like a bit of like a deeper breakdown of what exactly I'm talking about over here, all you have to do is like look at what the standard rectifier even looks like. Phrolova is a resonance skill, echo skill focused character that wants high base attack and not a lot of attack percentage. This weapon pretty much gives her the opposite of everything she wants. She doesn't want low base attack. She doesn't want an attack main stat because she already has 120% from her liberation. She doesn't want ER because she literally never uses it. And she also doesn't want basic attack because the most highest damaging moves in the basic attack part of her kit are dealt as resonance skill damage. And so effectively, all this does is give her base stats to attack that she doesn't really want because she already has a massive boost. And the entire weapon effect does literally nothing. A big part of the power budget in these standard 5 stars is the fact that they give ER. A lot of ER, especially as you give dupes. 12.6% or like 12.3 at level 1. That's like almost enough for a DPS to not need any ER rolls. They might need just one. But when Phrylova's a character that doesn't need any ER at all, the power budget of like that entire standard weapon is basically completely wasted on her. And the end result is that it kind of looks like shit. Like so shit that Augment, the BP weapon, with even worse base stats and all of that, is only like 6% worse than the standard, which is like, usually the gap between the BP weapon and the standard is way higher. But that's just how bad this one is on her. To the point where simply having critical damage is enough to be 10% better, which is like, doesn't make too much sense. So yeah, that's kind of like the unfortunate situation regarding Phrolova and her kit. It feels like her kit was intentionally designed not to work well with specifically this weapon. And even with it being designed not to work that well with this one, it's still the second best option. That is how flexible Stringmaster is. It's still the second best option, even with the kit that's designed to work against this. So yeah, that's my take on the whole tier 1 category. Let's start talking about some of the other units. Brandt should be bumped up once he's got his Sig. Encore's kind of like over here. She's consistent. I do think that at this point, Encore maybe should be bumped down a little bit. I don't think her damage is like that good at all relative to these other characters. Maybe when they have the S0R1 toggles, that's when stuff's going to be a bit different. But I feel like just right now in the current state of the game, I feel like her and Havoc Rover should probably probably be bumped down to tier 1.5, especially like this, because, you know, I consider Phrolova compared to these two, Jian, Zhang Liao, and Brant. It's just, I don't feel like these two really necessarily match up. I think Zhang Liao being in here with his lower overall damage output, but then quick swap potential, perfectly fine. All right, now for the rest of the DPSs, I think you just remove Chakota from here. I don't think anyone's playing Chakota main DPS nowadays. Maybe, I don't know. I think her being on both sides is kind of just, it's a little bit like memey right now. I don't know who's actually doing this. And then you got Chisha and Danjin. I think it makes sense. They're both pretty consistent 4-star characters that can clear, especially with all the support that they've gotten recently. Calcharo being down here, but then being bumped up to tier 1 with solid play makes sense to me. And then Alto and Ling Yang, kind of some of the worst DPS characters in the game with how single target focused they are. All right, now let's move on into the hybrid category. And boy, oh boy, do we have quite the things over here. We got Chakota over at the top because she works well with Kartithia. We got Phoebe over here because she works well with Zani. Believe me, without these two characters sort of like here, or without their sort of like partners over here in like the other debuff application department, I don't think these characters are that good. Phoebe's like a fucking tier 5 if you don't have Zani and you're trying to play her in confession mode, but I guess that's just how strong the pairing is. Then you got Sanhua and then Jeja. I think that the tier 0 right now, in regards to like their overall performance, it makes sense to me, but I do think you can make a case for flexibility here when it comes to these two units. Is them only being like really good on one team, is that enough to bump them down? Because you're never playing her without Zani, ever. And I guess technically you can play Chakona without Kartithia. She does have some pretty decent teams regardless. So yeah, maybe Chakona stays. But I don't know. I feel like Phoebe's specificness and absolute uselessness without Zani kind of is a bit of a dark mark on her profile. Tier 0.5, we're going to have Brant, Changli, as well as Lupa over here. I think the Brant, Changli, Lupa team is very strong. Feels good to play. Has potential to become very sweaty if you want it to. So I think the placement here makes a ton of sense. And then Mortifi down here. He's gonna 1000% be tier 0 when more heavy attack characters come out. It's just, we have none in the game. We have like 2 of them as main DPSs, and then Phoebe wants like a different character instead. Anyways, so it's just it's a bit of a wild situation. Meta characters. We're gonna have Cantarella, Rosia, and Spectral Rover. I think that these two being here, it both makes sense, but it's also like, I can see a case for them being tier 0.5. They even said it like S0R1, these units would still be at tier 1. I think Rosia makes sense because even with her weapon, Rosia feels like her damage output literally doesn't change between her having a signature and not. Her gameplay doesn't change at all either, and it's just kind of like, ugh. It is what it is. But I think Cantarella could be bumped up with their signature. I heard her performance is actually quite good with it. We will test it out when her banner arrives in the second half. And then Spectral Frazzle Rover being down here. I think because they have 2 use cases on 2 of the Spectral Frazzle teams, it actually deals some pretty damn good damage. I think it's fine for them to be here. Potentially even bumped up too. We're also going to have Danjin and Yinlin down in tier 1.5. I think Yinlin being the worst ranked limited 5-star unit is fine. I think it's fair. I think it's something that makes a ton of sense because she is so clunky. She feels like she does no damage sometimes. And yeah, it is what it is. I think she needs buffs. I think she needs like a partial rework to her kit. I think she needs some iframes and time freezes thrown in there. Her kit feels like it needs to be modernized to a degree. And I think that's something that a lot of people would look forward to. Niche characters. We're going to have Tao Chi, and damn, Yang got bumped down. Why is she so far down here? I thought she was a tier 1.5 the last time we saw this. Is maybe her grouping is just not that useful in the ToA, and like her kind of combo potential and her lack of ultra buff is dragging her down. But we'll see. And then in the very bottom, we're gonna have Alto, Lumi, and Jiajin. I think this is fine. I think like this is the category of characters that need to be reworked. I feel like this is the category of units that need some sort of dire assistance because right now they kind of exist to not do anything. The state of Arrow is actually kind of wild because these two characters have some very interesting kits that feel like they could do a lot, but they're just kind of sitting here doing absolutely nothing. I don't want Kuro Games adding in any new 4 stars when the current 4-stars are in this low-key unusable state, and John Shin is also in this unusable state. Because right now, adding more units while existing ones are dog shit is how you end up with Genshin Impact's situation, where maybe like 12 to 15 of the 4-stars that exist, when they have like 40 plus, are usable, and then half of the usable ones are only usable at S6. And so it's like, okay, they become like pseudo 5-stars, and then you end up just clogging the roster even more with like a bunch of trash. Just buff the older units first. Literally, buff the older units first before introducing more new 4-stars. I don't even care if the new 4-stars are good. You'll still have trash like this clogging up the banners. And it's like, you could just not make them trash anymore. People would probably want to pull more on the banners too if they're newer players. You could actually make 4-stars, beyond Sanhua, Mortefi, and a couple of others, a reason to pull on banners. That's also a way to generate some revenue. All right, now we got the support category, and we're going to go through this one fast. Shorekeeper Marina, always here. Who would have thunk? You got both Rovers in tier 1 in the support. Arrow Rover is still one of the most clunky characters ever, but they are on one of the best teams in the game, so that's really pretty much the only thing giving them tier 1 is like their weapon effect and their synergy with erosion. Otherwise, they're kind of just like, they don't feel good at all. They're one of the worst feeling characters in the game, if I'm frankly being honest. And then Spectre Rover as a sustain. They don't do a good job of sustaining, but they do have their unique time stop, Spectre Res reduction. Bit of more damage oriented one, and I kind of like their role in the game. Bai's just down here. She's still viable, but clunky. It is what it is. Yohu sucks, and then Yanwu's also like, I think he needs a debuff put onto his kit as well. He is such a bad unit. But maybe him being a bad unit isn't that bad because you can have like one dud, and he definitely is the most dud-worthy character. Now that we've covered the ToA tier list, covered the changelog over there, let's move on to Whimpering Wastes. Phrolova's getting added as a tier 0.5 DPS. Her kit seems way stronger in WhiWa than ToA. Yeah, if you would have noticed while reading her kit, Phrolova does some crazy shit. She has a bunch of different attacks. She performs a bunch of these enhanced ones across the T's rotation, and this one stagnates or freezes enemies. This one groups them, and then this one stagnates and freezes. It does both. And so the end result is that this character, especially in her best team, where you're also using a character like Rosia, they're like fully tractioning, sucking in all the mobs, and it's like they're not moving the whole time. It's almost ridiculous how good this team is in WhiWa, but on the flip side, when WhiWa is in the absurdly easy state that it is right now, where you can like spawn kill enemies, and there's no actual need for grouping just because you're killing them all instantly, well, the end result is that it doesn't feel as necessary. And that's like a bit of like a balancing issue in the sense that a lot of like the power budget in the Rosia and the Phrolova kit is on a mechanic that you don't really need to use that often because of how they tone down the difficulty. So that's kind of like the trade-off of the devs making content more accessible. It doesn't let you highlight the strengths and the use cases of certain characters and their kits as much. But there is a balance that you need to strike over there to not make the game seem like a Honkai Star Rail or a Genshin Impact in terms of how useful or necessary a character feels to clear the content. So maybe there's some sort of better balance that can be struck in the future. All right, she has her signature weapon issue in this tier list as well, but she's genuinely fantastic with Cantarella and particularly Rosia, making for a team that with practically infinite crowd control and consistent damage output. All true things. With her signature factored in, she's safely placed in tier 0, and without, she's tier 0.5. Yeah, I think that if WhiWa was actually harder, she might be potentially ranked lower because of the impact her lower damage output without her sig would have. But that's just a little bit of specificness there. Now we got Cantarella getting bumped up, much like how she got bumped up on the ToA list. Very similar reasoning. Phrolova good, so Cantarella good. Can be considered as a tier 0.5 character with signature weapons factored in, thanks to Phrolova retroactively impacting Cantarella's own performance as they are each other's best team. I would say Cantarella feels far more necessary for Phrolova than Rosia does. Phrolova already has her built-in grouping. Rosia also only has one echo skill, so I think this is actually going to be a character that gets replaced, which isn't that bad because she already serves a role as the best-in-slot sub-DPS for Camellia. Right? She's already technically Camelia's best in slot, though some people don't actually use her even if they have her. And so Rosia kind of feels like a half purpose in the Phrolova teams. So I think that there definitely is going to be an upgrade to this one in the future, because Phrolova right now can't even get off all of her enhanced attack triggers because Rosia doesn't have enough echo skills. So we'll see. Now let's get into what the actual tier list is looking like for WhiWa, and then we'll start wrapping this bad boy up. All right, everything is roughly the same here as before. The best AoE damage dealers up here, the ones with more single target hits or not as high damage like Chikona down here, or they kind of have a signature issue, so they're down here. As you can see, in the WhiWa list, I think it's just better to go over it as a whole, especially because we've already covered ToA. There's a lot more characters in the top spots. And I would say my take on this is that there are a lot more characters in the top spots because the necessity for damage is so low in WhiWa currently that there's a lot more characters that are able to like serve the main DPS role just at a baseline. Like Changli being in the main DPS slot over here is not something you would find in any other game mode because she simply does not deal as much damage as a main DPS, especially compared to all these other units, except maybe Chikona. But the thing is that WhiWa's health is like in waves. You want more constant damage versus big bursts. And so the end result is that Changli's design in her kit is like insanely good. And then that's why the Fusion team is kind of like the best over here. And I guess it turns out that the Havoc team is also kind of the best over here, which makes sense because these healer units don't necessarily have as much value because while they're on field, they're doing no damage. But then your Brandt's the healer over here, your Cantarella's the healer over here, and they're actually clearing waves while you're rotating on them, while you still have other damaging members of your team. So that's kind of like why this tier list is looking like what it is. That's why it's very top heavy. And so you're going to see at the bottom over here the same exact units that we've been seeing before, with John Jin getting buffed up a little bit because she does have some grouping in her kit, but not that much. And then there are some DPS characters more single target oriented that are just at the bottom, right? Like your Chisha. Alto isn't even a DPS on here because he's so unforgivably bad at AoE content. And yeah, the more single target oriented, big burst damage characters, closer to the bottom, but those with more AoE closer to the top. And that's kind of like how this one is breaking down, with supports pretty much in the same spot, but everyone as a whole just kind of getting bumped up more. And I think that's what you can expect to see. WhiWa right now is one of the more like low effort game modes. We'll see if that one becomes more difficult in the future. But that'll be that. Now, let's go ahead and do a bit of a quick review of what Prydwen is doing over here on their Phrolova page. What I want to take a look at is mainly their review, because we've gotten our first impressions of the unit. We've had a bit of a try with her, and I kind of just want to see how much I'll end up agreeing with their takes. Okay. So, this is kind of a big one. Let's see what they got over here. Pros. Deals very high damage both on field and off field, giving her a constant presence in gameplay. True. She is, in a lot of ways, one of the more satisfying characters in the game, especially from the mindset of, if you want a DPS that you're constantly seeing the impact of, if you're somebody that doesn't, want your DPS to be, like, off field ever, Phrolova's your unit. Because you start off the tease rotation with her, and Hikari will have permanent field presence. This unit never actually technically leaves, assuming you don't fuck up her rotation completely. So it's a very unique way to play the game for sure. Has no ER requirements whatsoever. True. Able to slot as not only a main DPS, but also as a sub DPS style buffer for heavy attack DPS characters effectively. Phrolova, Shorekeeper, Jian is actually a viable team. Yes, I know. It sounds fucking weird, but yes, Shorekeeper, Phrolova, Jian is actually viable. She's able to slot in not only as... Oh, yeah, we just read that. Has massive self-buffs to attack and crit, which doesn't make her reliant on other teammates buffing her as much as others. This particularly reinforces her sub-DPS capability. True. A lot of self-buffs, but what that means is that buffs from other teammates, like Shorekeeper's crit, Verena's attack, they're not nearly as useful for her. She would greatly rather have, like, I will say the biggest damage boost that I think Phrolova can have in this game is Rosia's S2. That's 40% Havoc damage bonus. And damage bonus is what Phrolova needs the most in her kit to have the highest damage possible, because she doesn't have it. She has every other stat. She has crit, she has attack percentage, but she doesn't have damage bonus. And so this upgrade over here, this S2, is actually, I think, Phrolova's strongest team buff. It will actually outperform Shorekeeper. It'll outperform all that other stuff that you're going to have available. She also provides a ton of crowd control effects and self-increases interruption resistance while reducing damage taken. In other words, making and ignoring enemy timing mechanics a breeze. Yeah, her rotation is very easy to get through if you weave in echo skills across it. And she also has top 3 profile icons in the game, arguably top 1. Okay, Glazer. Her animations are pretty good. Now, let's start reading the cons. Her weapon situation is worse than Brandt's. Treat Phrolova as a package deal. Pull her with her signature, else we recommend pulling Camellia instead for a Havoc DPS. I think that you could make the recommendation to pull Camellia instead, regardless of whether or not the signature is even factored in. Because this is kind of like the realization I think most people need to have. Phrolova is, quite possibly, the most unnecessary character in the game. From the perspective of, for her to have top-level performance, you need to pull 2 other limited characters, and they need to have, like, good builds. Like, if their builds aren't good, the team's performance is, like, taking a huge nosedive because of how much their stats actually contribute to the whole damage pie. On the other hand, when you run Camellia as a character, she's the only one that needs to be built. What? It doesn't really count to build a support. They're so easy to build. Like, a Shorekeeper with 150% crit rate or crit damage, and then the stats that she has right now, one takes like no time to farm, and then the difference between the teams is like minimal. Then you pair this Camellia, right, with your San Hua, who will like, I'll literally run her on an Overture with +0 echoes. This is actually like my go-to San Hua build. And then it'll clear endgame content with EOG. Literally. And so all I need to do is pull this unit. I don't even need to pull her weapon. I pull EOG. I build just her. And then her teammate is, her teammates just have like the worst echoes possible. And then I'm going in and clear the content. It's a quarter of the price, low key. It's like a quarter or like a third of the price of the Phrolova team. And it'll still clear the content. And honestly, if we're just going to be entirely budget focused over here, you could just play Havoc Rover as well. And that's what this character is also kind of stepping on the toes of in terms of place on the roster. Next, her Echo set is strictly only usable on her, and her weapon has low usage value except for Phrolova because String Master exists. Hence, if you choose to build her, her build cannot be shared with anybody else. But funnily enough, her build can take the pieces of other characters, which I think is something that if we're going to talk about how her build can only be used on her, we also got to talk about how her build in some ways is easier than other units because she only has a 3-piece set, but a 3-piece set is kind of a pain in the ass to farm. But the other 2 pieces should be easy. Due to her after sound stack ramp up and enhanced intro mechanics, her earlier rotations are weaker than later ones, particularly the first. I think that's just a gameplay part of the design of her kit, not necessarily a con, but it is something worthy to point out. She scales poorly off of attack buffs due to already having too much of it in her own kit. Also true. And we unironically chose to talk about music theory instead of explaining all the details of her kit that are never used in combat in a review, which would say a lot about how long of a read it is. Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a word count issue. Yeah, no, I would say Prydwen, aside from like the small things about like her Sonata set and like her farming, I would have talked about how hard her set is to farm, but I also would have talked about how she can steal pieces from Carlotta, steal pieces from your Rosias and your Cantarellas as well as your Camellias and Danjins, and then, kind of speed up, but also have the grinding process slowed down too. So I think that there are some slight things missing over here, but overall, absolutely spitting in regards to the strength of the character. But yeah, I would say Prydwen's update is brutal, but it is honest. And I'm glad that they've gone ahead and decided to sort of like rip off the band-aid when it comes to addressing some of the design over here, because I don't want to blame necessarily entirely Kuro's like development team for the state of her weapon and the state of her synergy. I want to blame the Kuro development team a year and a half ago for releasing String Master in the state that it's in, because I guarantee if String Master wasn't going ahead and causing people to skip every single rectifier banner since the game released, then I feel like they wouldn't have made it this specific. But because they've probably seen the data and they have seen everyone skipped like Phoebes, everyone skipped Cantarellas, everyone skipped Jejas, and they're just like, shit, we're literally not selling any fucking weapons whenever a rectifier character comes up because we made this thing fucking broken. And so it almost feels like they have been working out of like a different development angle ever since. And so I want to blame the String Master devs mainly because they made this thing too fucking strong. And now we're starting to feel the impacts of it. And knowing monetization and gacha, it is such an unfortunate situation. But it is what it is. We'll see how kind of like the options pan out in the future. Maybe she'll have more specific 4-stars. I know that Kuro Games, they've already done it a single time where they have gone ahead and they've customized a 4-star weapon for certain characters. I think that Phrolova is honestly a unit that probably should have had something like this released for her. And I think it would have done quite a bit. You know, it's something about like echo skills here, right? Instead of Spectrofrazzle. Could have been something that I think that a lot of players would be happy with. But yeah, that's that. That's our overview. That's our take on the new Prydwen tier list. Hopefully that was helpful. Let me know what you all think. Peace.